This interview is a co-production of WKTV Voices, the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project, and the Silversides Museum in Muskegon, Michigan. And we are, in fact, on the campus of the Silversides Museum today conducting this interview. And we're talking today with Sue Strum of Muskegon, Michigan. Sue, why don't you start off with some background, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
Okay, I was born in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada in 1951 to a Canadian father, and my mother was a U.S. citizen. She was at that point, she was in her late 20s, and for those times was considered a spinster.
Mm-hmm.
So she and her mother were traveling by train around Canada, visiting various relatives to see if anybody knew anybody who might be eligible. And my parents actually met at a tea leaf reading.
Okay.
He had taken his mother and her friends, and she had taken her mother and her cousin, and they're both apparently, I'm only here because I brought them, and the rest, as they say, is history. They came back and forth. Mom was a school teacher in Michigan, and he was an engineering student working for the phone company in Edmonton. And after back and forth for a few years, they ended up getting married in Muskegon, moved back to Edmonton, where Mom said goodbye to all of her friends and her bridge club that she'd been in from high school. And off she went 2,000 miles away. Well, in 1953, we ended up moving to Owasso, Michigan, with the phone company.
Mm-hmm.
Edmonton was at that time one of the largest cities in North America with a dial telephone system outside New York City. So everyone who was looking at putting in dial telephone systems was, stealing people from New York and Edmonton and various places. And with Mom having family, especially elderly parents in Michigan, that was the best we could do. And by 1955, we were in Muskegon. Mom was back on her bridge club. Mm-hmm. I started first grade in North Muskegon Elementary School and graduated from there in 1969.
Okay. Now, as you're going through high school, things in this country are getting kind of interesting.
That puts it mildly.
You've got the civil rights movement, you've got the counterculture thing, you've got the Vietnam War, a lot of this stuff, and all the craziness in '68. How much of that were you paying attention to?
Paid a fair amount of attention to it, but it was didn't really seem to affect us. North Muskegon had, at that point, and probably still does, a reputation of sending 99% of its students on to college. Mm-hmm. So, we weren't terribly, the guys weren't terribly worried about the draft. We followed it. We had a school teacher in 7th grade who, to the dismay of 90% of the class, said we had to watch the nightly news and write reports on it. And my cousin and I are going, we're going to get credit for what we do anyhow. Our parents, we always watched the news. So this is a bonus. So, we were aware of it, but, it really, North Muskegon to this day only has 3,000 to 4,000 people, and it's mostly, doctor, lawyer, Indian chief. So it was out there. We read about it. We knew people who went. By that point, we actually also knew someone who had died. So there was a Gold Star family in North Muskegon, which thankfully I believe is still one of the only Gold Star families. But no, just really, we knew it was there, but.
Yeah, and since you were a woman and not subject to the draft anyway,
right,
it'll make less of a difference. Okay, so what do you do after you finish high school?
I enrolled at Muskegon Community College and discovered that I really didn't have the attention span needed to pay attention. I had more fun playing poker with some of the veterans and active in student government. I was the treasurer of student government the second year I was there. And so as a result, my grades didn't quite meet muster.
Okay.
The employment, rate in Michigan was absolutely abysmal. There was very little opportunity, and so I said I need to do something, and right now college is not it. So I started looking at the military. Looked at all 4 branches. pretty well immediately crossed out the Army and Marine Corps, as they only offered a 2-year opportunity. And with a 2-year opportunity, you get very little in the way of training.
Okay. So they weren't offering longer, because if men enlisted, they could enlist for longer hitches. But that wasn't being offered to
I don't know whether they, the Marines and the Army basically were pretty much 2-year, active duty, and then especially the men had, others who were a 6-year commitment, because of the draft. But the Air Force and Navy, Navy required 3 years, Air Force 4 years, but offered far more, opportunity. And I ended up, joining the Navy, because I had 3 years, but, in a queer twist of fate, ended up extending to go to school and ended up spending just about 4 years in the Navy. So, it really didn't make that much of a difference in the long run.
All right. Now, at the point when you were enlisted, now what year is this?
In 1971.
Okay. And what was your citizenship status then?
At that point, I had dual citizenship because my father being Canadian, having been a Canadian citizen, born in Canada, my mother U.S. citizen. So for years, we, both countries recognized, our citizenship, either one, depending on where we were, and we just, had friends and family in both places, so we just went back and forth across the border, And it wasn't until my enlistment, paperwork was fairly well underway, and we were starting to discuss, departure dates, that the recruiter was brought up short with the realization that I needed to be a U.S. citizen. Well, having been in this country since I was 3, it wasn't any, real big deal.
But having dual citizenship, though, wasn't acceptable.
Was not acceptable for women.
Okay.
Men could join and use their time in service to become a citizen. But as I said, you've lived here 17 out of, your 20 years. What are the chances if you're going back to Canada? Which turned out to be somewhat ironic, later on. But because I'd been here as long, it was a fairly simple process. I had ended up with a private meeting with the federal judge in Grand Rapids, who swore me in, and I was able to make the original, deadline we'd anticipated for enlistment.
All right. So where did you go then for your training?
Everyone from, Michigan is processed then, I assume probably now, through Detroit. So, they sent us over, on buses to Detroit, where we spent the night, and got sworn in the next morning, given our orders, and sent originally by plane to Washington, D.C., and then a Navy bus picked us up and took us to Bainbridge, Maryland.
All right. Now, as you're going through this processing, are men and women together, or do they separate women out at some point?
As soon as we got on the plane, we were separate. Women's training back then was completely separate from men. We saw men in the mess hall, and during the church service on Sunday, we were not allowed to talk to them. They were not allowed to talk to us. We were told to consider men as trees. And everyone knows how much in love with, trees women are. So,
Okay. So, but like when you were processing in Detroit, for instance, or that kind of...
We were all just, lined up together, and then they just, parceled us out to the various, places. A lot of the guys probably got back on buses and went to Great Lakes. Or, potentially could have gone to Orlando, which was very well for men at that point, I believe.
Yeah, and then San Diego otherwise probably. But,
yes, that's right.
Farther west. Okay. But in your case, Bainbridge, Maryland. All right, so where in Maryland is that?
It is in the middle of nowhere. It is still apparently in the middle of nowhere. I've had chance recently connected with a girl who was in through a Facebook group for former waves, connected with a woman who had actually been in my company, and she has been back to Bainbridge on a couple of occasions, and she lives in the area, and she says it's still as nowhere as it was then.
As a naval base, is it actually on Chesapeake Bay somewhere, or is it inland?
It doesn't exist as a base anymore.
Okay.
Has not for many years. It was near Havre de Grace and someplace else, but we were there. We had no opportunity really to. If we went someplace else, they took us on a bus, and it really didn't matter because we weren't going on our own.
Yeah, but that's sort of the upper end of Chesapeake Bay, and there's not really that much there.
No, the closest city of any size is Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where they took us during one of the weeks where to pick up any of the things that we needed still for our required uniform, underwear, slips, etc. that we hadn't brought with us, or they just didn't have available on base.
All right. Describe basically the training process itself. When you get there, what happens to you?
Well, it was pretty strange because we apparently got there on Halloween. We got there late. Everyone else had gone to bed. Our luggage did not come with us. It disappeared someplace, arrived a week or so later. So we wore the same clothes for a week. Never did wear that outfit again. And I had loved it so much before that. But, we're just sitting on the stairs in the main barracks, it's known as Hunter Hall, while they, sorted us out and figured where we were supposed to go, since we were all assigned to, the few of us who were there, I don't remember how many there were assigned to various companies and stuff. And they gave us a sucker. Well, this is pretty strange, Well, little did I know that was one of the last suites I was going to see for several weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So it ended up making, a rather larger impression on me than a, simple little, lollipop with a, little paper hoop in it, would do, in any other circumstance. But they eventually got us sorted out, and the main barracks for women, as I said, was called Hunter Hall, and it held, I believe, 8 companies of women. Since they were getting, we didn't know this, but, in hindsight, they were getting ready to transfer the women's training to Orlando, which they did in July of 1972. And so knowing there would be some lag time, they kind of multiplied the number of companies going through ahead of time and put 2 companies in a barracks that had not been used probably since World War II. It was indeed a World War II barracks. It was 2 floors. Wood was condemned while we were living in it. When the company upstairs moved out, we thought we might, have won a lottery and got to use their bathrooms and laundry, and we were told it wasn't safe to go up there. And if there was a fire, don't worry about the exits, try and go out the windows. Just remember to go out the windows on the street side because it was built on a ravine and there was a 2-story drop on the other side. Fortunately, we never had that. But it was winter, and it was a cold winter for Maryland, and the furnace kept going out, the hot water heater kept going out, and they issued you 1 blanket. It was a little gray wool blanket, and it was your fire blanket. You weren't supposed to use in case of a fire. Well, and it had to be folded just so. Well, when there's no heat, there was like, do I unfold this thing? It's not worth the hassle. And our company commander, to her credit, did try to get us additional blankets so we could keep that one in its pristine shape. Mm-hmm. She was unsuccessful. So we spent a great many nights sleeping in our winter, what they call greatcoats, which is a wool overcoat, over our pajamas, just to try and, curled up trying to stay warm. So, while the people in Hunter Hall had, lots of, hot water and, heat and all kinds of things. So we were, we were special. We were tough.
All right.
And we did get some special, considerations because of it.
Okay. Now, so basically, the group that you came in with, did you all get put into that new barracks, or were you split up?
We all got split up. I'm not sure that there was anyone besides me, that went into, that company.
So you were just lucky.
Yes.
All right.
Story of my life.
Okay. So what does the actual training consist of?
The training at that time was mostly, paperwork learning, the various ranks, how to march. There wasn't a whole lot of physical training because at that point, most of the assignments available for women were office related, with the exception of, corpsmen or dental techs, although literally daily new positions were coming open.
Mm-hmm. So they were
So
starting
we were learning about the various professions, and a great deal of time was taken doing aptitude testing to see, what we were capable of, and then, therefore, what jobs we could be assigned, once we graduated.
So I guess this was, of course, over the course of the 70s, they opened up a lot of opportunities
Yes.
for women in the military. So was this kind of the beginning end of that, where more things were becoming potentially available?
Very much so. Very much so. When I qualified for a number of categories that many the women were not eligible for, and some that were but did not have any vacancies at that time. So they said, we're going to put you in the next most qualified training opportunity there is, but keep an eye open. We're going to note it in your file that when and if one of these other opportunities comes open, we encourage you to apply for it. Because chances are, if there's an opening, you'll get it, especially because by that point you will have some prior service.
Mm-hmm.
So I ended up, as a result, being trained as a dispersing clerk. I went to Naval Training Center in San Diego and trained there for, again, approximately about 10 weeks. But by that point, once we finished basic training, men had ceased to become trees, and they were back to being human beings again. And we had classes with, guys. We could talk to them on a regular basis. We could, associate with them.
Okay. So it's going to back up into the Bainbridge part of things for a little
Sure.
bit. What kind of women were in your company? Were their backgrounds or?
We had everything from kids. You had to be 18, so we had women who were 18 on up to somewhere in their mid-20s. It just and from all various backgrounds. The girl who actually had the bunk below me was Salvation Army, and she brought her bugle. And so once they found out about that, whoever was on night watch would come in about 5 minutes early and wake her up. Although they always seemed to wake me up instead. Like, no, lower bunk, and she would get up and she would blow reveille. Well, it gave me a little bit of gave the people in our little cubicle a bit of a heads up so we could, hit the ground, when we were running.
Okay. And when they do that, was there sort of a set of things everybody has to do X, Y, Z within a certain number of
Yes.
minutes? So if you had the advance warning, you're waking up, that was helpful?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And what sort of people were training you?
Oh, we had, it was all women. First class petty officers, various ratings. My company commander was an aviation storekeeper. I don't remember the others, but they were all usually first, occasionally a second class petty officer in training, but usually first class or chief petty officers. And then, of course, the officers, commanding. But again, it was all female.
Okay. And how did they treat you?
They treated us very well, except for the food. The food was absolutely horrible, and almost everybody got food poisoning. And instead of worrying about gaining weight, pretty much everybody lost weight, a lot of weight.
So much for the reputation of the Navy having better food.
Oh, they have much better food other places. They just didn't have it in Bainbridge.
Okay. All right. And so how long did you spend at Bainbridge?
It was approximately 10 weeks.
Okay. And then from there you went out to San Diego?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And what did the training there consist of?
Training there consisted of primarily using, how to calculate payroll, how to use, a calculator. Some of them they had electronic calculators. Some of them were behemoth mechanical monsters that had probably been in use since War II, and some of us just frankly used our heads and figured it out until we got caught and said, no, you have to use the machines.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just kind of a repetition. This is what you do. If they go on leave, this is how you process it. If various scenarios of pay. If leave time, sick time, if they get transferred, this is what you have to do, etc.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And how long did you spend training there?
That was, again, approximately, I want to say about 10 weeks.
Okay. And were there men in these classes now?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah, the majority were men.
Okay. And what kind of dynamic was there between the men and the women in a class like that?
mostly, helping and sharing. We're all in this boat. We're all new, pretty much for the most part, all new to it. So it was just, if you help me, I'll help you, because everybody had their own strengths and weaknesses, and we were in this together to get our company, through to graduation.
Right. Okay. All right. And then, did you get to go off base in San Diego?
We did. Mostly, we did some exploring, Balboa Park, the beach. Biggest thing, of course, was Disney. There were buses that would run up there, especially on weekends. And back then they had the old e-ticket type thing, so you bought, you got your entry sheet along with a whole bunch of coupons, and, but you didn't use, you brought back, and, kind of put in a pile, and then, so somebody else would come and they'd take this group of coupons with them, and they'd, have to buy the entry, and but then, you just use, and then you bring it back, and just, it went on until some poor sucker, when they went to the, general admission, was stuck with a whole bunch of coupons that didn't work. But that was, the big thing, because we were from all over the country. Most of us had never been to California. We'd come out, especially those of us coming out of Bainbridge, where it was, miserable, cold, and icy, and being in the warmth, San Diego in February, was really pretty wonderful.
All right. And once you complete that course, what do they do with you?
Well, if you graduated, they shipped you out. It seemed like everybody who graduated got transferred someplace else, and those who failed got to stay in California. Nobody was willing to intentionally fail. We were all mostly, new to this stuff, and just, but ended up going from there to stationed in Charleston, South Carolina, which really was a wonderful place, but, it wasn't San Diego by any stretch of the imagination. And there were, probably, half dozen of us who all, from various trainings who had met in San Diego, all ended up in Charleston, and we used to get together in the, enlisted club, and, I think we wore out the jukebox playing California Dreaming by the Mamas and the Papas, and we just sit there and, play pool and, sob that we weren't still where it was nice and wonderful and warm, Yes, we were still with someplace where it was gorgeous with plantations and, wonderful things, but, it just, for kids, most of us in our, late teens, early 20s, it just didn't have the zing that, San Diego surf culture, seemed to offer.
All right. So what was your actual job?
My job there was handling payrolls. I started out handling payrolls for submarines in the main office, which actually was off base. It was a fairly large facility, and we had, as I said, submarines. Back then, the submarine station in Charleston were some of the early nuclear subs, and they had what we call blue and gold crews. So you'd have a crew that was out at sea for 6 months, crew in training on land for 6 months, and then this, the sub would come in, get, refitted. The other crew would take off, and I did that for several months, and then I got transferred, promoted. I'm not quite sure exactly what, but to a small office on base where I handled payroll for minesweepers. And they pretty much stayed put the entire time. They thought they were pretty lucky, and for the most part they were. Although, our office there was a one experimental cement minesweeper, which was more just outside our office, which meant we had very little daylight. The minute the sun went over, noon, it went behind this enormous cement thing, and we were in the shade all the time. And of course, the Vietnam War is winding down. They're starting to think, things are looking up. We've managed to miss out on everything. Little did they know. Little did we know. The orders came through to send all the East Coast minesweepers to Haiphong Harbor to clean out the mines in North, Vietnam.
Yeah, it's part of the peace settlement or whatever. Yeah.
And so, their, leisurely, tours of duty came to a fairly abrupt end. And for reasons that to this day, and this happened in 1973, and I still don't know why this many years later, filling out the paperwork required somebody with a security clearance.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the only one in the office with a security clearance.
So how
I'm a
was it?
naturalized citizen. I'm the only girl in the office, and I'm the only one with a security clearance. So I fill out all this paperwork. Well, the Navy, and I'm assuming the other branches had something similar, had a 5-digit code, that was attached to the name of whatever place you were going to be, or, if you were in transit, there was a separate code for these. Well, there was no code for enemy territory. So that part of the paperwork all had to be left blank. So I fill all this stuff out. Well, to back up slightly, while I'm stationed down there, the rating for orographers' mates, which is weather observer forecasters, which they had originally hoped I would be able to become, opened up. So, following orders from, previous, I applied for and was accepted, to become an orographer's mate. But it meant an automatic change from a seaman rating to an airman rating. But I still kept my rank as a dispersing clerk. So instead of being a DKSN, I was a DKAN, which does not exist, except on me. So, we get all this paperwork done, Lieutenant Commander checks it over, everything's fine, we send it off. Sometime later, I don't remember exactly when, the phone rings, he picks it up, next thing I know, Susan, there's an Admiral so-and-so from Washington wanting to talk to you. And I'm going, I don't know any Admiral so-and-so, I don't know any admirals at all. Well, he asked for you. So I go up there, and I'm literally standing at attention next to the Lieutenant Commander's office, which is where the phone was. And he's this, man who says he's Admiral, and we have no way of verifying this, is reaming me out for this horrible job I had done in this paperwork, and this fictitious, signature. And I'm going, well, and so I had to explain to him, that I was in the process transferring between being a dispersing clerk and a orographer's mate, and the change in, rank had come through before the change in rating, and that I was told I would still wear my dispersing clerk emblems and sign as dispersing clerk until my orders were cut and I left Charleston to go for further training, at which time then I would just simply become an airman. He bought that, but then he's still fussing about the paperwork, and there's no codes. Well, I don't know who this person is. I've signed. I've got a security clearance, which I'm not about to divulge. My lieutenant commander is staring at me, and so I'm trying to think of ways to hint to this gentleman how he can come up with the answer himself. And I realized from being a fairly neurotic newspaper reader that the biggest thing in all of the papers lately had been emptying the Haiphong Harbor of mines. And so I just finally do you happen to have today's newspaper handy? Why please humor me a minute, would you please can you tell me what the headlines are? Well, the headlines were the removal of mines from Haiphong Harbor, and the light bulb went off. And he immediately became very apologetic, and said that the paperwork was great, and he wished me, the best wishes on my future endeavors, and hung up, and I'm standing there shaking like a leaf. And my lieutenant commander looked at me, it's like, you look like you need a drink. I said, I think I need two.
So basically, the other people in your office didn't know what the assignment was going to be? Or you didn't know whether they knew it or not?
I don't think they did.
Okay.
I'm not sure. Part of it was somewhat of I was, again, I was the only girl in the office. We had, most of the rest of the office were Filipino. For some reason, becoming a dispersing clerk was one of the easiest ratings for them to get into, and for the most part, they all seemed to excel at it.
Mhm.
But there was still a bit of a language barrier, and for reasons that I can only guess, my first class petty officer, who one would have thought would have been was a black gentleman who, for whatever reason, could not get a clearance. So that left me and the lieutenant commander, and lieutenant commander's not going to do the paperwork.
But in the meantime, I guess, did you have anybody else hearing you talk except the lieutenant commander?
Oh yes, the whole office could.
Okay, so you couldn't just blab these things
No.
in front of that audience.
Because, plus I didn't know, this man says he's an admiral.
Yeah.
I don't know that it isn't somebody trying to test me to see whether I'm divulging this information or not.
Yeah,
So
okay.
it was,
Now, and the initial stuff that he was fussing about, that was because you had listed your new
I was
creative
signed
rank.
as a DKAN,
Yeah, which
rather than
didn't exist.
DKSN,
Yeah.
and this part of the paperwork on where they were going to was blank.
Yeah. Okay.
So it was
yeah.
just kind of a multitude of compounding errors. That,
Yeah. Now, did the minesweepers leave before you did? Or?
oh yes, they left. They were leaving as I was processing their paperwork.
All right. And did the cement minesweeper go away?
Yes, it did.
Okay.
I managed to see a little bit of sunshine before I departed.
All right. Now, one of the things we work about Charleston, you're in the South, and it's now made it into the 70s, but there are aspects of segregation, discrimination that kind of last a long time. Did you notice any racial issues at all?
No, not at all. Again, we basically associated with, other people, we worked with, and the women's barracks were actually right next to the Naval Hospital. They had actually been women's officer quarters up until some time. I don't know where they, I imagine they probably ended up giving them an allowance to, have housing off base. So they then turned it over to enlisted, and we only used, a small portion of the building. But, it was, for an enlisted person, it was kind of heaven. You've gone from sharing with 70 women in basic training to 4 women while you're in A school, and now you've got a room to yourself that you share an adjoining bath with somebody if that room happens to be filled. There were few of us, enough of us there that most of us had bathrooms and rooms completely to ourselves.
But when you go out into the community, I guess, is the question.
We usually went with the people we were with. We went. It really wasn't. The bases provide pretty much all the entertainment and everything you needed. Go off base usually was to go. One of the fellows that I was dating at the time had a motorcycle, so we'd go for go out and go off in a motorcycle ride. But usually we rode with somebody else who was also in the Navy. Really didn't have too many opportunities. Now, my parents did come and visit me a number of times, and we went out and explored, Charleston and some of the plantations. But to be honest, I didn't see any overt signs of racism until I was working in a planning office in Lake County, Florida, in 1995, where sadly my supervisor pointed out that if you looked, you could still see where blacks only had been painted over on the waterfowl. And that was sad and sickening. To think that in that day and age, someone could still be proud of it, and proud of the fact that we had a former, imperial wizard living in Lake County.
All right. So I got to go back now to your career. So how long then did you spend in Charleston?
I spent about a year
Okay.
in total there.
All right. And now you get your new rating, and then you have to go to school for that?
Yes, absolutely. That school was in Lakehurst, New Jersey, which is about halfway between Philadelphia and Atlantic City, a little further north than that. It's where the Hindenburg crashed, and the hangar that was used for the Hindenburg and other blimps is still was still there in the 80s, and I understand is still there. I'm assuming now it has a historic preservation designation to protect it, but it's unbelievable to picture the scale of the blimp until you see the hangar.
Because the blimp would fit inside it.
Yes, most of it would fit in. The tail oftentimes didn't. But when my dad found out I was going to Lakehurst, he was so excited. He had a recording of various events in history, and he dug it out and he played a copy of the recording of the gentleman who was covering the landing.
Right.
It was the first landing of the season, and this classic "Oh, the humanity," and just to see it for real, it still sends chills up my spine. I got to know one of the base photographers, and I have 4 copies of original, photographs of the Hindenburg while it was crashing. And he said, you can take anything you want as long as you don't take the last one or the negative. And those are, have been proudly hung in pretty much every apartment I've had, and are very, they're just, it's horrible, but it's, exciting, and it's history.
Sure. Okay.
And I can say I've actually been there. I've been in the hangar. I've been in the back of the hangar, and stayed in the back of the hangar. While I was there, they had a big air show with the Blue Angels, and the Blue Angels were doing some practice runs, and one of them crashed, and the pilot was killed. And one of the women from our barracks who was permanently stationed there, happened to be on duty that day and had to go out and take the pictures of the scene. And she was naturally extremely shook up, and so we took turns literally staying with her 24 hours, because she just if I go to sleep, it just I see it again. And so when they they coerced us as students to help out with this thing, and we're all going, we'll help, but we're going to be in the back. We don't want to see, we don't want to risk seeing another plane crash. They didn't have any plane crashes, but you see 4 go over and 3 come back, and your gut tells you, something's wrong, and then the alarms start going off, and
So what else goes on what actually was going on at base besides training people for your job?
There was actually there was a station there. We weren't the only people being trained there. I don't remember what the other training was, but there was an actual duty station. Lakehurst abuts, is it McCoy? There's a big Air Force base, just
Okay.
Adjacent to it, and I want to say there's an Army facility there too. And so they did all kinds of joint maneuvers. And when I went back in the late 80s, mid 80s to Philadelphia for graduate school, I took time and drove out there. And at that time, and from what I've heard from other people, the base is now, and has been for many years, a top secret facility. And there's just basically a place where you can turn around at the gate, and and if they're not busy, they'll talk to you, and I was stationed here once upon a time, and those buildings are all long gone, and, but the hangar is still there, and you can see it from the road, but beyond that, they have super top secret clearances, well beyond anything I ever
All right. So what did the school consist of?
School consists of teaching you various cloud types, precipitation types, everything from rain to snow to sleet to hail to hurricanes to, tsunamis, various weather patterns, what various winds mean, how to plot them on a map, and then how to make sense of it once you've got, the information on a map. Just every hour, observations are required throughout the entire, not only the naval system, but the entire meteorological, world. And back then, once you did it, you took your observation, you put it in your logbook, put it on your maps, and then someone else usually had to be, you take turns, there were always at least two people in the office, print it up on a teletype machine, one finger at a time or so, and send it out so that everybody else knew what you had so they could add it to theirs. And that was how we developed, the idea of whether fronts were coming through. We had some very, very basic, satellite images that, sometimes you could see something and, sometimes, the satellite just was, not going to cooperate and you had nothing.
Yeah, I guess there was a nationwide radar system by that.
Very little for weather purposes. It was, still,
it was still early enough in the 70s.
Yes.
It's not as common as it would become.
No. And the satellites were not nearly as, efficient as, now they can, they can pick out the license plate on your trailer and, if you're standing out there, what, brand cigarettes you're smoking. We would be lucky to say, is that a cloud or is that a ship? Or is that just a blip, in the satellite, download? And sometimes you literally, had to guess and go back and look at, the previous reports because they only came in like every 6 hours. And well, based on that, it's still in the same place. That probably wasn't a cloud. It really was a ship, or a sandbar, or who knows, a whole island. You just kind of got to, by guessing by golly, figured out, what was what, and to think that, we would spend hours doing this stuff, which today they, it all comes in the computer and prints out in, 5 minutes, everything that we spent, a couple of days doing.
Did you have computers at all?
No.
Not there yet?
No.
So what year is this now?
This is 73 through 75.
Okay. All right. And you were living on the base at that point?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And could you get off the base or do anything else?
You could get, in Lakehurst, we could get off the base and go to, various places when you weren't studying. But, it was a fairly, far more intensive, training program than to become a dispersing clerk. So, a lot more time was spent studying. That there was, there was a lot more material.
You had to memorize a lot.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And again, that's still the school. So
Yes.
once the school finishes, where do you go?
Well, as with any other schools, the postings come open as to what has become available. Well, it turns out hurricane hunters had an opening. It required someone with prior service time. 2 of us qualified. He had been in the Navy 28 days longer than I had. He got first pick. I mean, it's every weather guesser's dream to be in the hurricane hunters. At least, we thought. So he picked it. Second choice was between Adak, Alaska, or Roosevelt Roads, Puerto Rico. I chose Roosevelt Roads, Puerto Rico. Before my orders were cut, he had bailed on the hurricane hunters. He decided that was not for him. They tried to get my orders recut, and it didn't work. So somebody, a couple of classes after us, potentially got lucky. I never did here. But Roosevelt Roads being warm was definitely, more interesting than the land of horizontal snow.
Okay. So what was at Roosevelt Roads?
Roosevelt Roads was the largest area-wise base the U.S. Navy has ever had. Most of it was underwater at high tide, and barely above water at low tide. The airfield was miles from anything else. I was only the 12th woman ever assigned to the base, and the first woman in the weather office. So, but it was, it was a city unto its own, which was, rather fortunate, because at that point, we weren't paying a whole lot of attention to Vietnam because we were more concerned with the political problem in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico had probably 20, 30 political parties, all of which were warring with each other to the point of bombing and shooting. There were a great number of times where we were restricted to base because of the danger, and there were a couple of times the power lines to the base got cut. They were reestablished very quickly, but you couldn't go too far. Fortunately, there was a really good Puerto Rican restaurant literally at one of the gates, and so if you couldn't go anywhere else, you could go there. And, oh my God, they had the best rice and beans. I've only found managed to make it like that a couple of times, but so if we went as a group, usually a couple of times. The weather office, and anybody who wasn't working, our got a lieutenant commander in charge, got a van, and we went out and explored El Yunque, the rainforest, which was right near the base, and then we took a trip inland to Arecibo, which is where the big radio telescope is. And I did end up seeing the other end of the island where Air Force had a base on a visit with a group of SEAL team who were visiting from Norfolk. But it was pretty strange, especially the rainforest. They had been trying to repopulate it with birds, but the poverty was such that people were killing the birds for food, even though the brightly colored birds really have very little meat on them, and their value is in their looks. But you go in and it would just be, you go into a rainforest and you expect to hear birds chirping, and all you'd hear with the little coqui, the little frogs that are like this, who could and almost nothing else. It was almost spooky.
All right. And were there any kind of distinctive events that took place while you were there, or things that disrupted the routine other than worries about the Puerto Rican violence?
I think I disrupted the routine more than anything else. Once again, I get down there, and every time you take an observation, you log it in the book, and you're supposed to initial it with your first and last initials, which in my case would have been SS for Susan Strum. Those initials were already taken. So then we look at, well, what about your middle initial last name, which would be MS? Already taken. This is an office that's only got like less than 20 people in it. So, okay, what about first name, middle initial, SM? It's taken. I'm going, what am I supposed to? They had to get special permission from someplace for me to use 3 initials. And to this day, I sign everything with SMS. It just became ingrained in me during, my time there. Why do you use the initials? It's just, I can't do it any other way. But it was interesting being the first woman in the office, with some adjusting, but, just everybody was really helpful, and we all, you kind of worked as teams, and, especially if we worked 11-hour days and 13-hour nights, and so you kind of take turns literally, curling up under the drafting board, one would be stay awake, the other would take a nap, a couple hours later, you'd switch. Only, problem, came if there was, in somebody's infinite wisdom, the weather office was located on the parking lot side away from the airfield. We had to go out and, we were responsible for maintaining reports on the weather on the airfield. Well, we couldn't see it. We either had to, wait for our equipment, which was out on the airfield to start, if it was raining, we had we had equipment that would measure it, and it would, we did have computers. It would come in and measure into the computer, and we would, read off the measurements, etc. But they were, giant, like ENIAC type things, and, all they did was tell you what happened, but nothing, beyond that. You had to figure out what the numbers meant. Or, the air traffic controllers, who fortunately did have a view of it, say, hey guys, it's raining out here, you want to come take an observation? And then depending on what the situation was, especially, because the land was so flat, you get a lot of, it didn't take oftentimes much rain to cause major flooding. And there were several instances while we were there of people trying to, do what they tell you to this day. If you see running water across the road, don't try and cross it. Well, somebody was, I got to get back to the base, or I'm meeting somebody, and get washed away and drowned. So, we could send out our reports to the other weather stations through the teletype in the office, stay nice and dry. Unfortunately, for flood warnings and things like that, had to go to the communications center, which was about the opposite end of the base. On my shift, I was the only one with a military driver's license. The guys had all managed to lose theirs. One of them by passing the base commandant's car. I mean, guys, it's got flags on it. He's got an escort. What were you thinking? He was lucky he was able to stay in the Navy without losing any rating or rank. So that was always real fun, because the only time you had to do it was if the weather was really nasty. And so you're going, doing to the, water's over the road, doesn't matter, you got to get to the comm center, and then you got to get back.
Are you driving Jeeps or regular cars or trucks?
Pickup truck.
Okay.
Stick on the column.
Did you ever drive through running water to?
Oh, absolutely. And over land crabs, they had these huge crabs that I don't think were edible. I never knew of anybody, but they were, I swear to God, the size of plates. And the rain would wash them up, and you'd just be driving, and you'd hear them crack into the wheel. And there were times I come back in the office, and I am just, I'm sobbing, because I've killed so many of these crabs. And by the next day, the rain has washed them all, or somebody has eaten them, and the road's clear again. And I'm like, but it's going to happen again. I don't want to do this. Can't we get somebody another driver's license?
All right. I think about the time that you spent in Puerto Rico. Are there other aspects of that experience that stand out for you?
It was fairly calm for the tropics. We had no hurricanes while I was there. We had, some winds. Fortunately for me, I decided, when my time to get out came, I had, saved up, about my 30 days leave, and I chose to, you could either, stay to your end and cash it out, or you could use it or a portion thereof. Well, I chose to use it, and came back to Muskegon and enrolled in community college. I got all set for I could start the fall semester, which had I stayed there for the 30 days, the semester would have already started. It would have I could have tried to play catch up, but just didn't figure that would be a real good idea. So I got everything done here, and then went and spent about a week and a half at Great Lakes in a transitional barracks while they processed my paperwork. Came back and jumped into classes at MCC and got going. Well, in the meantime, during those 30 days, a hurricane developed. And there were 2 or 3 guys who were supposed to be getting out at the same time I did, and they all got their, time in service extended for, good 6 months and experienced, a hurricane, because we were on the far, eastern edge, so we got the first full brunt of anything, coming, through the tropics. And
so if you
it's an experience
there,
that I really,
were they extended because there was just a lot of work to be done to repair the base?
Because of the weather office, Still having to do stuff. And I ended up, spending about 30 years in Florida, so I ended up with enough experiences with tropical storms and close to hurricanes that, made up for missing one in Puerto Rico.
Now, had your plan always been to do just one enlistment and then leave?
I really wasn't sure. My original plan had been, to do the 3 years, but then in order to get the additional training, I had to add an additional, not quite a full year, but it was close to it. So I ended up spending close to 4 years, which made the Navy and Air Force virtually identical in the end run. But I decided, finally at the end that since they said, sign the paperwork, then we'll talk. And I'm like, I'd really rather like to talk first. But since that's not what you're going to do, I'm going to get out and use the GI Bill to go back. And I think I know what I want to do, and I think this may be an area that I'm really interested in. So I, came back to, community college. Of course, living at home, JC didn't cost that much. So I used very little of my my money. And then after I got my associate's degree, I ended up going back up to Edmonton, where I was originally from, to the University of Alberta, which is the college that university my father had gone to, thinking I was going to major in meteorology, because it was between them and Michigan State. And having been gone for 4 years, Michigan State was just a little too close. I mean, Mom and Dad would want me home every weekend, or they would be showing up, at school every weekend, and I just, I was not ready for that.
Yeah.
I had moved on, and so 2,000 miles, worked out. As it turns out, I decided it really wasn't. I enjoyed the social sciences more than the others, so I switched to social geography, ended up with a degree in urban geography with a minor in sociology. And then came back to Muskegon, where the employment was a little bit better, but not a whole lot. So I spent some time working for my father in his engineering office, and he designed electrical and mechanical for buildings, and was also very active in the initial renovation and restoration of the Hackley and Hume houses here in Muskegon. So, anytime anybody was home, we got hauled in on that, as a separate thing. And then I got hired by Muskegon County in their planning department. But after just about 2 years, they decided to eliminate their department. So basically said, use our resources to find yourselves other jobs. And there were, they had one fellow who they transferred to the working for the bus garage as a planner, and the other two of us were just kind of left to our own devices to find things. And I decided at that point it was a good time to get a graduate degree, so I ended up going to the University of Pennsylvania in city and regional planning. And while I was there, I was offered a job by the city of Orlando as a planner, and I took that job and then spent pretty much the next 30 years working in Florida.
Okay.
Initially, doing a little bit of everything: housing, law enforcement, fire planning, some environmental, and then ended up specializing in affordable housing, working with first-time home buyers and nonprofits that provided housing for disabled and very low-income households, and that was real rewarding.
Okay. Yeah, and I guess given how much building goes on in
Yes.
Florida, the diverse population, everything else,
Yes.
there's probably
Yeah.
a lot of business
Yes.
there.
And the program they worked for actually was a grant program that was funded through the sales of property. A certain portion of the taxes went into a trust fund, which worked really well for a while until the governor discovered, and several governors discovered, that they were allowed to scoop some of the money out to balance their budgets, and the money became less and less. And unfortunately, that kind of tied in with my retirement date, and considering that my supervisor also did historic preservation, which I had some knowledge of, but was not, the expert she was, so I couldn't take her position. And the other person in the office made about half of what I did, and plus I was the only one at retirement age, so it just worked out, rather provincially, that the money ran out and my time, was, clicking as well. So I retired in 2012, moved back to Muskegon. 2013 became a volunteer here at the Silversides, and the rest is history.
Now, back in the time that you spent in the Navy, how would you characterize the climate for women at that time?
Most of the time it was very good. There were a couple of instances where individuals themselves, caused problems. But overall, the Navy was really pretty receptive, at least where I was. We did have one instance of a senior chief petty officer at Lakehurst who was stationed there for some other reason. It had nothing to do with our school, but he insisted on coming to the graduation parties, and he outranked pretty much everybody in the program. And the officers had told him to stay away, and what are you going to do? And he would go, and he would fondle his poor, and these kids, they're 18, 19 years old. They're terrified of this guy, as they should be. And the people, our instructors and everything just kept, and so, when it gets time for our class to have the parties, I'm kind of, I've heard about this guy and watch him, and I'm trying to keep him away from some of the younger, and he grabbed me, and I bit him. I bit his arm, and I bit him hard. I drew blood.
I take it that actually worked.
It did. I got congratulations for months after that when people found where I was, because he never came back. He had to go to the base hospital because I had broken the skin, and he had to explain to them what had happened. And I had lots of witnesses, and he never bothered the AG school again. I mean, I was sorry it came to that, but I'm glad I was in a position to do something, however distasteful that it was. Just talking to this guy didn't work, but other than that, everybody I worked with was, for the most part, was, there was always some hesitancy first, when you're the first woman in the office, what's she going to be like? But, hey, I went to the same school, and, learned the same things you guys did, had the same training, and had the same opportunity.
And I guess the working environments that you worked in were ones where usually there weren't that many people, a small group like some of these meteorological things,
right.
Or even with the disbursement thing, you're in the office where the lieutenant commander's right there, and the Filipinos, were they female or male?
Male. I was the only female in that office. There were other females stationed in the main office, but I was the only one in the sub office.
Yeah. But in those places, you might well not have had a subculture that was conducive to harassment or anything like that. Because it pops up periodically.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
I have heard, I've heard horror stories. Fortunately, never, other than that one instance which I just related to you, was affected by it, thankfully.
All right. I mean, to look back on it now, what do you think you took out of your time in the Navy, or what did you learn from it?
Oh, it was a great experience. I learned patience. I learned to focus. When I went back, to MCC, I teased, there were a lot of the same, professors and staff there, and I went from, the dean's list to the dean's list, and he recognized it, and it was encouraging.
All right. Well, the whole thing makes for a good story, so thank you for coming in and sharing
Yeah.
today.